Alright, hey y'all. We'll just jump right back into this. So, as you were saying there, Alex, leaving off, that you wanted to think about the shift, transition from the classic to the modern. Unless you you had another question. Oh, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I have several questions, but maybe we'll get to those at the end and trace like some of the history that Foucault lines before we get to the questions, maybe.
Foucault does history?
Yeah, that's my question. No, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the transition from the classical to the modern episteme that Foucault charts. So he says on page 238, quote, representation has lost its power to provide a foundation. So why? This is like one of the questions.
Yeah.
So I think part of the answer is, again, one of those people that I think Foucault focuses on because they're a border figure for him between two epistemes. So he talks about the Marquis de Sade, right?
Mm-hmm.
He says on page 211, quote, after him, Sade, violence, life and death, desire and sexuality will extend below the level of representation, an immense expanse of shade which we are now attempting to recover as far as we can in our discourse, in our freedom, in our thought. But our thought is so brief, our freedom so enslaved, our discourse so repetitive, that we must face the fact that that expanse of shade below really is a bottomless sea, end quote. So for him, there was a shift in which representation was revealed to be insufficient to describe everything. So we really can't have a transparent language in which we simply like represent a thing with an arbitrary signifier and just like describe the whole world that way. There are things that will escape representation always. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense to me, and the reason that it makes sense to me is that I think about discourses pertaining to value or wealth in the early 20th century, and how there was, in the move away from any sort of reference to real things, where culture, where pecuniary decency, where class started to derive its meaning not necessarily by anything tangible or real, but precisely by the relationship of signs to their signs, if you will, or of the rather arbitrary association of some things with certain prestige or class or whatever.
Yeah, he talks about precious metals in particular, right, as the not valuable in themselves, but valuable as pure signifiers of value.
Their weight in gold or whatever
Right.
But I don't know, are you ready to talk about the analysis of wealth yet, or should we go to grammar first or anything else first?
We can talk about those if you want to. I feel like I don't have much to say about those.
Okay. Then I just have a question for you.
Okay.
What is it, and this is, I think, really broad, what is it about, and like I have an idea, but I'm curious to see what you might say, what is the difference for Foucault between Marx and Adam Smith? Like, where does he say, you know what, I don't want to do Marx here, I'm more interested in Adam Smith?
Right.
Or Ricardo.
Yeah. You mean, why does he focus on like Adam Smith and Ricardo in the history that he gives rather than like Marx?
Yeah, and it's not so simple as he just like disavows Marx. Like he condemns Marx.
No, but
it's like Marx is useless today, right? There's nothing you can get out of Marx.
But Marx would be for Foucault in the modern episteme, and I think he's like he's less interested in articulating that history, right? Like,
Sure.
I think he wants to articulate the history of the discourses in the classical age and how they shifted or moved from how we moved from the classical to modern episteme. But I don't know. He's not particularly diligent or interested in describing the modern discourses.
No, right, because he just blows past them.
Right.
And I'm curious as to why that is, because these discourses really have an effect. And like even at his time, right? Like if we were to use Marxism as an example, like we think of when was this written? 68? Like this, yeah. Pretty sure that this was 68. Or late 60s, nevertheless.
67?
Could, yeah, 67.
When's the original French?
You know, there was a lot of the stuff going on
66.
66
was the French, yeah.
Well, nevertheless, there was a lot of stuff going on.
68 was on the horizon.
Yeah, 68 was on the horizon. Like it was certainly coming, right? And for him to say this of Marxism exists in the 19th century thought like a fish in water. That is, it is unable to breathe anywhere else.
Right.
Like there's more than a disavowal, like, oh, I'm not interested. Like,
Right.
a flat out condemnation.
Yeah,
like
but I think he's interested in Marxism in this context in that it's thoroughly historical, right? It's a fish in water in the modern episteme in that it's thoroughly historical, so it could only exist in the episteme that's also thoroughly historical.
So how do you... Right. Because this is what you said before we started. Like, how do you want to think about this new episteme or what's going on? We won't have to get into that, but that's interesting. And then, okay,
I don't know. I'm not sure that's a sufficient answer.
I like if I don't want to press you on it, so we can just.
You can. Yeah.
Like he doesn't have to be interested in it because he can be interested in whatever he wants to be interested in. But it seems like almost like a glaring
omission.
Yeah, especially because he spends so much time on Adam Smith and Ricardo, where he's like,
right.
But I mean, as far as method goes, so then we have the physiocrats, right?
Yeah. On
the other side, or whatever, somewhere in there, thinking about the physiocrats and that kind of relationship to land, which to me, I think of a representation in that way. There's that very utilitarian type association where you have wealth or value or whatever derives directly from the soil,
mm-hmm.
from your toil, the sweat of your brow or whatever, which I think serves an interesting cultural function if we were to think about representation and the role that it would play like in relation to representation. Not to say that it necessarily has that affiliation, but I just transposing his discourse around language or the signifier and the signified or the referent, and then the physiocrats relationship or the relation that they kind of illustrate between wealth or value or whatever and the land, like a very what we take to be the ultimate referent, that thing that doesn't change, just that soil
right
exists everywhere type thing. And I just found it interesting in that way. And then I feel like that was just a big digression, but I will ask this, okay, what is it about then Adam Smith that he's interested in?
Oh, now you're challenging me.
Just to
I would say I don't know that section well enough. Like, how is Adam Smith a paragon of representation? Right?
Yeah. Because he says this. He said, just as Smith had used the constant value. So this is just as Smith had used the constant value of labor to establish the natural price of things that is in the play of equivalences, and just as Ricardo freed labor from its role as a measure in order to introduce it prior to all exchange into the general forms of production, so Cuvier, another figure, freed the subordination of characters from its taxonomic function in order to introduce it prior to any classification that might occur, into the various organic structural plans of living beings. So that, then we're thinking of that other shift, right?
Right.
Like with Cuvier, like into from the taxonomia, but taxonomia. Jesus.
Maybe. Yeah. It sounds like in that particular quote, he's pointing to a process of making the sign arbitrary in like those multiple works.
Yeah.
Right? In a way that like moves them into the episteme of representation.
Yeah.
Right? So like what was the first bit about Adam Smith? If you still have it there?
Yeah, I still have it here. So I just jump back a little bit because this is like not totally about him, but he says it about Cuvier not about Cuvier. This is the quote. In his project for establishing a classification that would be as faithful as a method and as strict as a system, Jussieu had discovered the rule of the subordination of characters, just as Smith had used the constant value of labor to establish the natural price of things in the play of equivalences, and just as Ricardo freed labor from its role as a measure in order to introduce it, prior to all exchange, into the general forms of production, so Cuvier freed the subordination of characters from its taxonomic function in order to introduce it, prior to any classification that might occur, into the various organic structural plans of living beings. So like all these kind of streamlined kind of the ways in which these new discourses came into being, or how these shifts occurred, or the kind of figureheads, which is ironic to kind of to think of it in those terms, especially like because we don't want to give it that single point, right? They're a locus. But because for Smith, there's no like end per se, right? We think of the Wealth of Nations, which I haven't read, but
I've read it years ago, so I don't remember.
Really?
Yeah, parts of it at least.
But I read a distinction there between him between Smith and Marx, precisely because Smith, in a sense, foresaw, and not deliberately, he was not conscious of this, but foresaw what would come to be the condition of language in whatever age we would consider to be the one where language just proliferates, where the sign is arbitrary or whatever, where there's simply just the classical age, right? So, God, this is so complicated. Why do you make me read this? No, I love it. It's good.
So can I change tack a little bit?
Yeah, I wish you would.
I'm going to bring up one of the big questions that we were talking about before we started recording. When I read Foucault more and more, like in working on my thesis, I consistently ask myself, like, why is Foucault still valuable? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure his histories of specific things are the answer.
Yeah.
Right? So, in reading his early stuff, so like The Order of Things, Birth of the Clinic, and History of Madness, I have been reading them with an eye to like his overall methodology and his or like what he wants his methodology to achieve. So the reason I say like I don't know that section very well about the economics part is because like I read them, but I'm less interested in the specific things that he's reading into these texts.
Yeah.
Than like what he's trying to do with them.
That's fair. Yeah.
And the sense that I get is that some of the specific histories that he has drawn and the connections he's made have been challenged by a lot of other intellectual historians, not just based on Foucault's intentions, but also just like he got the history wrong. Or not
I've heard some things
wrong,
like that.
But like his interpretation doesn't hold up if you examine other stuff, right? Like there's the concern in this text in particular that he relies on specific specific texts, specific authors, and like, does that really represent a whole discourse?
Yeah.
And does the collection of 3 different discourses represent a whole episteme?
Yeah.
He says specifically at the beginning, there are other like more scientific discourses in each of these epistemes that he could talk about, but it's the ones that exist in the gray areas of science are more like squishy, rather than like hard science, that interest him and get less discussion, right?
Like by secondary type stuff? Like by the people who take
Yeah, by like intellectual historians.
Right.
Right. Like it's easy. It's. I think for Foucault, he thinks it's easier or like more glamorous to do like a history of physics, right? And it's these softer, like what he calls like the sciences of man, that get less airtime, but have been no less significant for Foucault.
Yeah,
right? I mean, they've led to the development of man, as a concept, as a object of science. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's just my excuse for not knowing.
No, that's
his
good
analysis of particular figures. Yeah, I'm just not convinced the histories that he traces are where the value still lies in Foucault.
So what do you propose as like an alternative? Like how do you read like this text then?
Yeah, so I think the value, I mean, I feel bad using that term, but I think what's useful and interesting is the way he talks about power, and part of that is the creation of subjectivities, right? So he does this. This is he shifts to this more in his later work, right? But that is what this project is trying to do in part, right? Is to trace how we came to an idea of man or humanity, mankind, as a possible object of science, right? Yeah. And all the power relations and the way discourse works that not only condition but affect those modes of those processes of subjectification in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because like, if we we're kind of alluding to this earlier, but can we let Foucault off the hook? And I wonder to what extent, like we might be able to get those types of analyses out of him, right? We might be able to find something useful. Like there's certainly a lot useful.
I want to be clear. I don't think they're useless.
No, yeah, for sure.
But just like I'm not sure. Like I said, like that's not my focus when I read Foucault.
Right, but I mean, those things that we do find useful, however, to get like kind of polemical about this, to what extent are they in themselves things that we should be suspicious of? And how I was thinking about this is Foucault's use or thinking about language, specifically languages. So the question I wrote verbatim is, does Foucault's disavowal of the plethora of languages prior to the consolidation of the main languages tell us something about his own complicity in the hegemony of these kind of like broad categorizations or whatever? And the example that I'd give when thinking about this is that it's France. So France, there's this book on my shelf there that's called The Discovery of France, where the guy kind of lays out how prior to the consolidation of French as like a language, there were like hundreds of languages.
Occitane in south of France. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Brittany,
like from
Normandy.
And you can get that in India now currently, right? Like I think India
Yeah,
recognizes
Foucault talks about
14
the sun, right?
in here. Like,
no.
because he
No, I'm thinking of someone else. I forget who. I was reading about this not too long ago. I forget who it was, though.
But like India recognizes like 14 languages,
Right.
like I think like official languages, and that doesn't even account for
Like regional
from
dialects.
yeah, exactly, from town to town. Like speaking to a guy that said like you can't understand. Like my neighbors upstairs here, they don't they can't communicate to people that are in the next town. Like they just it's just another language. So Foucault's, I guess, trace of these kind of broad languages in a sense, it's not as though he needed to necessarily talk about all the languages. Like that's impossible. But it seems as though it's just missing, like to at least mention like, hey, my talking about these languages now came about, at least like when he speaks about French or English or whatever, came about through a process of homogenization in a sense, where like that guy says, when France became Paris, right?
Right.
Or Paris became France or whatever. So in that way, we think of Foucault as the thinker of history or the thinker of subjects, thinker of subjectivity, the thinker of power. To what extent does his reliance on these already formulated, I guess, meta discourse languages, these things, in a sense, kind of mirror those same structural problems?
Yeah, no, I think he would agree.
Yeah, and he does, like...
I don't think he would... I think he would say it would be impossible for anyone to escape the power dynamics in which they have become a subject.
And he says in, like, the history... The second volume of the History of Sexuality, he says, like, yeah, I'm just going to write about the Greeks here, but we have, like, 20 texts from the Greeks, like, maximum? This should not represent the whole, but this is all we got. I'm gonna do what I can here, and that's really what I like about him.
It was Simone Weil that I was trying to remember who.
Simone Weil.
Yeah, she writes about the like original violence required to like create the nation of France, like the subjugation of the South. And by the North, that type of thing, and like the centralization in Paris.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said,
so you think he needs to acknowledge that? Foucault needs to acknowledge that.
It's an impossible task, right? And
like that just seems like one particular way in which he is implicated in the power relations, or like.
Yeah, no, there are other ways, and we could get into that. So it's a little bit petty.
Right, no, I think he acknowledges it in various places, but like it's almost a moot point for him because like you can't help the conditions in which you come to be.
Yeah, well, and that's, he wishes he could kind of open up a new discourse, but it's ironic in the end of the Archaeology of Knowledge, he's like, he wishes he could just be dropped into like some discourse or whatever when he's talking about this stuff at the same time. In the end of the lecture there, in the discourse on language, or
yeah,
like he just wishes he could be dropped in or whatever.
Again, like I'm not certain how to read that, because I think his point is such a hope is also always moot, because you can't ever begin a discourse new. Right, like we were saying in the last section on this, where like the author doesn't ever radically begin a new discourse.
Yeah.
As like, from nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, the hope to begin a new discourse is always impossible.
Yeah, and
from I think we're getting away from the text a little bit, but
that's fine. It's just
also the hope that you could just like slip, like he says, like slip into discourse imperceptibly. Like that's also a foreclosed possibility for Foucault, because despite that hope, like the cultural institutions, he thinks they still like require the author as like the figurehead of a discourse, right? Or like to stand in as the originator of a discourse when in actuality they're just a figurehead, right? So like we can talk about like Foucauldian discourse, and like Foucault is the person who began that type of discourse, but I think he would say like he's only like a figurehead of it, or his discourse did not just come about through sheer force of will.
Yeah.
Right? Like there were conditions that allowed it to come to be when it did.
Yeah, like conditions that allowed for it, right? Because if it didn't allow for it. But then again, there's that kind of subtle Hegelianism.
Yeah, that's a creepy determinism, right?
Seeping through, and it's like,
right.
what do you do then?
Right. Why don't we drop that for the minute? And let me see what else I have to say. One. Yeah, no, this is what I've been grappling with the last few weeks.
What do you? If I can.
Yeah.
Press you on it a little more. What are you doing with that specifically?
Well,
like, what limitations do you see in Foucault?
Well, like I said, like so some of the secondary stuff. There's one person in particular that I found who was like, Foucault wanted to figure out how he could write about discourse from outside of discourse. And I was like, no, he didn't. Like, he distinctly says you can't do that. Like, in, I think, many different ways. And, like, the discourse on language is one particular spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was kind of, like, writing against that in particular. So the thing that I'm struggling with and, like, trying to, like, formulate coherent thoughts about is if the cultural institutions, or the episteme, condition what discourses come into being and defang them before they even come to be, or like only let discourses that are sanitized and not dangerous to the existing order, then how does anything change, and what potential for change or like radical disruption is there? So like turning that back on Foucault himself, like how is his discourse new or innovative or radical in any way? Like how can he hope that his discourse would change the power structures that he's talking about? Right? Because those power structures have conditioned his own discourse and allowed his own discourse to come to be.
Yeah.
Right? And he specifically says, like, that must mean his discourse is not dangerous. Right? So how does Foucault make discourse dangerous again? Or how do we make discourse dangerous again?
When was it dangerous though?
Good question. I don't know. I don't think he answers that particularly, but he talks like in some general terms about the like totalizing tendency of modern discourse and like the modern episteme. So I think he sees the modern episteme as particularly defensive and hostile to like any discourse that's like not it doesn't condition itself.
Because how do we the transition from one age to another?
So this is, I don't mean to interrupt, but this is what I thought you were going to bring up earlier.
Okay.
Is another like common critique of Foucault is like he doesn't give an answer of why or how we transition from one episteme to another.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So some people like bring up the comparison between this and Thomas Kuhn, right? On the on the History of Scientific Revolutions. Is it history?
You tell me. I would
Which
butcher
is
it.
On the... Yeah, maybe it's history. I don't remember the title exactly. But where he charts like different scientific paradigms, right? And the shifts from one paradigm to another. So people draw that comparison with the order of things sometimes, right? And like, oh, Foucault's like talking about paradigms. But yeah, he doesn't really give a satisfactory answer for change, right? And this is the same problem that I was just talking about that I was struggling with, right? Is like, if there's such a control over discourse by the prevailing episteme or the cultural institutions, how does anything change?
Yeah,
I mean,
because then we would inevitably, because he seems to think as though there's something new going on, a new form of like control, like if we think of the shift from order to history is much more malicious precisely because it's so much more difficult to get out of, just because it's been naturalized to such an extreme extent.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Again, like, I think you could apply the same argument to the end of the classical episteme and say, like, order is so hard to escape. Like, the world and the cosmos are naturally ordered. Like, how do we think past that?
Right.
But, like,
so
it happened.
So there's something else going on, or there will be something else going on, right? If we were to be like what would that new space look like? Who's to say we're not already in it? Like,
right. So I think... Again, like this is me speculating a little bit, but I think Foucault's own work, he already thinks he is on the cusp of another episteme.
Right.
I don't know if I wouldn't go so far as to say that he positions himself as another Cervantes or Marquis de Sade, who like gestures towards the new episteme, but I think he realizes or believes that he is at the end of the modern episteme.
Right. And there's a passage here that I think kind of captures that, at least like the polemical kind of style that he mobilized at specific moments against what was going on like today. So on page 373, he says, "To all those who still wish to talk about man, about his reign or his liberation, to all those who still ask themselves questions about what man is in his essence, to all those who wish to take him as their starting point in their attempts to reach the truth, to all those who, on the other hand, refer all knowledge back to the truths of man himself, to all those who refuse to formalize without reading it out loud, is like, to all those who refuse to formalize without anthropologizing, who refuse to mythologize without demystifying, who refuse to think about without immediately thinking that it is man who is thinking, to all these warped and twisted forms of reflection, we can answer only with a philosophical laugh, which means to a certain extent a silent one." Now, okay, this is what, if we are in this whatever age we could consider ourselves in now, or the one that he was writing in, like whether he had moved into a new one or whatever.
Well, he does say at one point that the modern episteme still grounds contemporary discourse.
Okay.
When he was writing.
Yeah.
He makes that claim.
Then, okay. See, and then when he has this passage and he's laying out, I guess, the existence of these kind of oppositionary forces to the thing he's trying to, what it seems like, move into. Like the kind of thinking he wishes would become like commonplace or manifest. Like these figures, these people were like, I'll just point
reactionary.
to this. Yeah, exactly, yeah. What place do they serve without necessarily, like, Hegel really fucked this up, because Hegel, we could just be like, oh, it's part of it, but it seems to me, without pointing to Hegel for myself, you could do it if you want, but like, this attests to something of a shift.
Right.
Or at least, even if Foucault is leaving those people behind, or that in itself represents a whole different process than what he's necessarily trying to do. And like methodologically then, we could say that perhaps he was successful at doing that. But perhaps this whole move, like this kind of bifurcation between, those who are, whatever, to be as vulgar as I can about it, those doing it right and those doing it wrong, like, is another part of the system, that kind of binary 1-0 thing, that perhaps a trap that Foucault fell into.
Okay, there's like three things I want to say, I think.
Don't lose them.
The first one is, and this is in, I think, the order of things, but it's also very clear in the introduction. Well, very clear is hard to say with Foucault. I think it's clear in Introduction to the Archaeology of Knowledge, which I keep going back to.
No, that's good. It's good.
He says he wants to escape anthropology.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And like the anthropological chains of thought. Mm-hmm. So that quote that you read, that's how I read that quote, right? Which is those like traditional thinkers who are stuck in the modern episteme still rely on man as the basis of thought and reality.
Yeah.
And he really wants to move away from that. The second thing I want to say is one thing I consistently remind myself is that when Foucault shows that something's historical, that we had previously assumed to be ahistorical, in this case, mankind, humanity, that means two things. It wasn't always like it was, it wasn't always, it didn't always exist.
Yeah.
And since it's historical, it could cease to exist.
Right.
Right? So in pointing out that man is historical, he's also implying that, well, he says it explicitly at one point, mankind's a recent invention and perhaps one nearing its end.
Yeah.
Right? So if in the modern episteme, we're in the episteme of history and of anthropology, i.e. of an idea of humanity, Foucault wants to move past both of those restraints.
Yeah.
And so the same operation, I think, this is the third thing that I want to say, the same operation is at work in the idea of the historical episteme, where Foucault makes history itself historical. Right? So in the classical episteme, history didn't have the hegemony that it does in the modern episteme.
Yeah.
Right? But that implies we can move to an episteme that's not historical, i.e. history can end if we want to be hyperbolic about it. So man himself becomes historical and history becomes historical.
Do you think that it would be safe to say, because we think of Foucault as the thinker of subjectivity, or that kind of coming into being, that there is a connection between this formulation of man or the human or whatever and subjectivity?
Yeah, in that mankind is taken as the basis of subjectivity, right? All, again, this is, I think, all in the introduction to the Archaeology of Knowledge, right? Yep. He talks about mankind as the last bastion of subjectivity.
Yeah.
And another way that he expresses this is the need to decenter that last remaining center. And the last remaining center is humanity as, or man as, the center of all thought, or the basis of all subjectivity.
Now, what I want to ask is, can that derive from man?
Can you decenter humanity from a point of subjectivity?
Right, because if we think
by humanity,
if we see a relationship between man and subject, and Foucault, the only way he can speak about that is by emulating both of those, kind of embodying that. Then how do we know what he's saying It's another systemic trap.
Right. And I mean, yeah, yes. How do you subvert discourse from within discourse? Yeah.
Because he was the thinker of like no identity, right? Like, didn't he shave his eyebrows and he was bald and he like didn't want to.
And what you quoted before, right? Like, don't ask me to remain the same.
Yeah.
Like, don't ask me who I am. Don't ask me to remain the same, right? So, I think he definitely tries to like disavow any stable subjectivity that people imprint upon him.
Yeah. And this, I feel like a lot of people, or many people, really bastardize Foucault because, they take, what do they take from Foucault? They take the panopticon, they take sexuality, and then they take, madness, right? And they leave the rest for the birds.
The archaeology of knowledge is not popular.
No. And it's not like anyone needs to take that up.
No.
But those things aren't easily digestible, but those are moments that don't call into question the use of Foucault, right? Because I think that Foucault was very much aware of it. Like you said, I think that if he was sitting here, he'd be like, yeah, you idiots, like this is obviously.
So, again, like a reason I really like that quote about his texts being explosive or like fireworks or self-destructing upon use is like that's not only his text but like that's part of his own I don't like using this word but identity, right? Or like that's what he hopes, sure. Right? Yeah. Like that same type of impermanence, right? So like one question I've had is that's part of Foucault's answer of how to subvert discourse or the episteme that you're in from within.
Yeah.
Right? Is like you blow it up.
Yeah.
Or like you try to blow it up from within. And I think there's nothing saying that he was successful. Or I should rephrase that. There's nothing guaranteeing that he was successful.
Yeah. Like, I think he died too young. He still had another 20 years of writing to match the other French guys who wrote way too long, but...
Looking at you, Derrida.
Yeah, Derrida just kept going. Baudrillard lasted the longest, I think. Wait, no, Virilio's still alive, though, so he's still around.
Derrida made a big thing about being the last of the 60s generation, right?
That'd be Baudrillard.
He wrote a text that was just, someone compiled a collection of eulogies that he had written, right? One about Foucault.
Right. And Deleuze was dead in the
yeah, I mean, I think he opens it with, like, talking about Proust and, like, walking through the cemeteries, right?
Yeah. So... There's a point on page 364 when he says something interesting about origins that, I think it speaks to a certain cultural logic, and I'll tie it back to this idea of subjectivity in a moment. But he says that, but whether this stratum of the original, revealed by modern thought in the very movement in which it invented man, is a promise of fulfillment and perfect plenitude, or restores the void of the origin, the void created both by its recession and by its approach, in any case what it prescribes as thought is something like the same. Through the domain of the original, which articulates human experience upon the time of nature and life, upon history, upon the sedimented past of cultures, modern thought makes it its task to return to man in his identity, in that plenitude, or in that nothing which he is himself, to history and time in the repetition which they render impossible, but which they force us to conceive, and to being in that which it is. Drop the mic!
Right, but I think in that is a lot of like what we've already said, right? Like mankind as the origin of like everything, and like a sense that like mankind is a plentitude in itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but how do you, because this is where it's so hard for me, because how do you conceptualize anything coming into being? Because I can only possibly think about that very process through the order in which I am found, right? Whatever I consider the epistemic conditions of my own existence. I can't think of that process of anything coming into being, whether it be Las Meninas or whatever, without thinking of a certain subjectivity or a certain kind of
creator,
mankind or humankind, whatever, forcing that thing into being.
So you're asking about the episteme that we're in.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if my thinking that way.
What does an episteme post subjectivity look like?
Yeah, that's it. And there's a lot of post-human stuff.
I don't know, man. We gotta find out.
So, it's.
We'll know in 100 years.
Yeah, what is? Because at the same time, we think of Foucault as perhaps a thinker that tried to emulate and embody a sort of post-subjectivity in a sense. He tried to efface that identity or whatever. But at the same time, in this contemporary condition, or we can think of Baudelaire, right? The Flaneur or whatever, the alienation in the city. There was no. I think in the case of Baudelaire, there's no subjectivity, right? You're kind of stripped of your identity, or the stranger.
Yeah.
We think of Camus.
I mean, Baudelaire in particular talks about the crowd, right, and the alienation you find in the crowd.
Yeah.
And how being part of the crowd strips you of subjectivity, right?
Yeah.
And you become part of this larger being.
Yeah.
But lose yourself in that. Lose your individual subjectivity.
Yeah, exactly. And just being the case of modernity, in the case of Benjamin or something.
Right. Yeah.
So it's it seems as though when he was writing this, Foucault was talking about something that had actually been effaced perhaps long ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tradition of the idea of effacing subjectivity in modernity, whether intentional or not.
Yeah.
Foucault, it's intentional in. Baudelaire, it's not, right? He's writing against that effacement of individual subjectivity, right? As a negative trait of modernity.
But to that, I would say, because in the case of Baudelaire, there is a focus on the individual experience, one that affects everyone. It seems as though there's such validity to that I ask of Foucault, what are you saying that it hasn't already occurred?
Right.
This loss, this dissipation of man or the human. Why is this? Why do you think that saying this is anything new?
Yeah. I read Foucault as in general, just trying to point out that we could think and be otherwise, right? Just in a really general way, writing against any claims that this is how it's been and this is how it'll always be.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what I was talking about earlier when I said everything that he reveals as historical could also cease to exist.
Yep.
That in itself is one way that you push back or resist the epistemic hegemony that you're within, or the cultural hegemony that you're within, right? Is that that you show that things could be otherwise.
Yeah.
Right? But I mean, it's
to what
very,
extent does that then serve the cultural logic of the time? Because if we were properly Foucauldian about it,
right? Yeah,
there's
this is what I was saying earlier. Yeah.
Because then on the other side, the other front, we think of Deleuze or whatever, in that Deleuze and Guattari, there's a very heavy emphasis on the possibility of becoming, right? Possibility. You're not multiplicity. You're multiplicities. You're always in flux. You're always changing. You're always trying to craft out little spaces for yourself to be whatever you want to be.
Yeah.
But for Foucault, I think he'd be
he's much more pessimistic.
Yeah.
I mean, what can you do? You can resist stable subjectivity.
Yeah.
You can write he can, not, who can write text like Foucault, but you can write texts that explode upon use in a attempt to subvert stable discourse or like stable epistemic conditions.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Well, yeah.
He has a really great quote I think it's in his outline, I don't have it here, outline of the genealogy of morality? Genealogy of ethics. It's an interview where he outlines this project, but he never actually got to do it. But he says, my point isn't that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous. And if everything's dangerous, we always have something to do. So, I don't feel that's particularly satisfying, right? Like, we always have something to do. We always have to be cognizant of the way, or like aware of the way that new discourses or existing discourses are dangerous.
Yeah.
And the way that they create subjectivity to their own ends. But there's no grand revolutionary gestures.
No, and that's one of his things. I would think against Marx, right? Trying to think of that in terms of there being the possibility of that kind of utopian ideal or whatever. But if there is this possibility for resistance, to what end does that serve?
Right. If Foucault's discourse is conditioned by the existing epistemic conditions, and he's inciting us to resist in whatever minor way that he outlines.
But if we were totally optimistic and we were to say, like, yeah, resist stable subjectivity and, write texts that explode, and that served a certain resistive function, then what?
Then possibilities, I guess.
My thing is that who is to say that is not already embedded in the conditions of whatever we find ourselves in? And this is where the Foucault of power comes in. Thinking Foucault in terms of like there being these very strong oppressive mechanisms that keep things where they are.
Yeah.
But I wonder if that's not just another phase of history.
Maybe this will clarify things. We're always in power relations for Foucault, and this is bad because we're kind of getting outside of the text, but we're always in power relations for Foucault. We can always resist power relations for Foucault.
Mm-hmm.
So total or like totalitarianism, I guess, is never complete.
Yeah.
So there's always the potential for resistance, however meager. So like what you were saying earlier, like there's never going to be like total control in a way that individuals can't resist.
Yeah.
Or like can't do something.
So what I was thinking was that perhaps there's no such thing as power, right? I don't want to get too Baudrillardian about this.
There isn't.
He says that at some point. Like he says that. I was trying to find that at one point. I was trying to remember where he said that power doesn't exist or that power is just.
I could find a quote for you somewhere.
But if we accept that, then what is the point in even analyzing this current episteme in this way? Like, if it's just another phase among other ones, we will inevitably move from it, right? If power doesn't exist.
Right. So why resist power if we're going to change to a new
if it's just going to move on anyways. Yeah.
Right. Why not just wait it out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I wonder, in the other epistemes, right? Like were there Foucaults at that time? Like,
right.
It's kind of an odd question, but like.
Well, no. Again, I would say like
resistance, like.
like, to what extent does Foucault, like I said, want to position himself as like another Marquis de Sade, who's in between Esteems or Cervantes. But your question's a good one. Like, yeah, why resist if change is going to happen anyways, and we can't like do much to either stop it or hasten it?
Yeah.
I mean, there does seem to be. I think this is a hard critique of Foucault to make, but there does seem to be a latent morality there, right? Mm-hmm. So if you say something like, well, we want a more just society, right? So we need to resist unfair manifestations of power. So like his work in the prison system, for example, right? I don't see where that morality comes from for Foucault.
Like just the wanting to do that? Like just the desire to...
What basis does he have for claiming that morality? Right? Like you could say like... Yeah, no, I don't even...
Yeah.
But so the reason I say it's a hard critique of Foucault to make is because normative claims or like prescriptions for ethical change are very... You have to read them into Foucault's work.
Yeah.
Right? Or at least like his major texts rather than like his essays.
That's how many people take it up like now though. Like they really...
Right, yeah. But you have to like read between the lines, right? And like all these things are historical, so it could be otherwise, so we should make it otherwise, so we should make it more just.
Yeah.
Right? But you have to take the last 2 or 3 leaps there that I said, or the logical claims that I said, like in addition to what Foucault says. Right?
Yeah.
Like he kind of gets you there, and then you have to like insert your ethics.
Yeah. Because like there are moments in this too when this is like, you know, Foucault was left as hell, right? Like he.
Yeah.
But there's also some kind of like neoliberal type like sentiments. I think kind of like strewn throughout his work in a sense. Like there is that subtle emphasis on individualism or the one person's capability to. Like in the example in Madness, to really get away from the text, he says of like the man who claims to be made of glass.
Yeah.
Right. He says that this person is not illogical. Like he says that if he's like made of glass or whatever, if you fall,
following strict logic. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like he is abiding by a certain systemic code, like to a T. And it's in that way that I'm like, okay. To what extent is there like a very heavy democratization of these sort of values that can be then, reinserted into a system that very much relies on this kind of like, hyper capitalistic type, like, logic or whatever, where that doesn't see any boundaries, doesn't see any limits a la Simone Weil or whatever, but just sees like total endless possibility.
Right.
Which I'm like, shit. And that's, for me, that's one of my critiques of Deleuze as well, where I'm like, I get a little bit weary when it's like we start to think about
like how do we, if Foucault's agitating for resistance, and that resistance is aimed at like either a new episteme or like changing the current one, how do we make sure that whatever we come to next is better?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Like there's no, like I said, there's no ethical prescriptions in here.
Yeah, it'd be impossible to know.
The concern is novelty for novelty's sake, right? Like, is that the prescription?
Yeah. And that's thinking about the end of man, and thinking about this as having been something that occurred a while ago, perhaps, makes me think that, these types of analyses can only actually ever occur retroactively, where it's, how do you necessarily... Yeah, which makes me suspicious, and there's like... I honestly think that Baudrillard is a very good extension. Where Foucault leaves off, I think in my mind, Baudrillard really takes off, and I think that they really borrow from one another, because Baudrillard says that, how do we know that production in the case of like Marxism hasn't already disappeared? Or he says of Foucault, and forget Foucault, like, how do we know that power hasn't disappeared, or power isn't gone, or whatever? But the point of, without really straying too far away, is it possible to actually analyze something or take a Foucauldian perspective on something, if even, you and I are now considering that perhaps Foucault's discourse itself is, at the time of its conception, was it outdated? How do we possibly try to take something from it now and apply it?
It's particularly fraught with the order of things in the archaeology of knowledge, because Foucault then moves on to a not different but distinctly new methodology afterwards, right? Like she shifts to genealogy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And changes to that. So it's almost as if Foucault himself realized, oh, this isn't working, or like this methodology is insufficient for the project that I want to do.
Yeah.
So I don't think genealogy is separate, but I think it's definitely distinct for sure.
Yeah.
I was going to say something else. Roberto Esposito says specifically Foucault named a type of power just as it was ending.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think like Baudrillard takes up the mantle from Foucault in one direction, or like you said, like can be an extension of Foucault in one direction, but I think Esposito could be an extension like in another direction.
Sure.
Namely the biopolitical.
I'd forgotten about that, the Esposito thing. Yeah.
So I think it's not just the sense in Foucault that he is at the end of a specific era. I think other people have, secondary commentators like Esposito, have made that type of comment as well.
Yeah.
So, like, are we in the episteme of the biopolitical now? And, like, what would that mean? If it's like, if we're not in representation and we're not in history, are we in, I don't know. I don't even know what you would call it. Biopolitical doesn't seem to fit right.
Yeah, simulation for like...
Well, Baudrillard would say simulation, but then I think
even later in his career, he's like, no, that's done. Like, there's no way. We can't.
The other thing I'd be interested in too is like it seems like it's accelerating almost on Foucault's account, right? Like you go from like the Renaissance, which is like, I don't know,
pretty long period,
to like classical era, to like the modern one. So like the modern one for him is like 150 years, maybe.
Yeah, and then we could give it like, if I don't know what credence
he's always
the postmodern term would have.
Yeah, he's always so fuzzy with dates, right? It's like every time he says an actual date, I'm like, okay, I gotta note this down for like a reference point.
Yeah.
I mean, it's understandable because he's talking about like macroscopic cultural trends.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Do you have any final thoughts, maybe? I feel we're just musing now.
It's because we have to.
It's not a bad thing.
Like, this guy's really, I really love reading him, but then it's like, but talking about it is
no, and like I said, I've been puzzling over these questions for quite a while now, and they're hard.
Yeah, it's so unbelievably dense too, and like someone listening, if anyone's listening and they're like, no, I found this quote that says you're wrong, and like share it, but we're like,
but see, we could just say, oh, that was Foucault on one particular day.
Yeah.
The next day he said the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, but between every book he
changed
a little
his subjectivity.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think that could do it. I feel like someone could, take 12-week long course on this book alone. Personally, it's.
Oh yeah.
Because if you were to dig out all the different references that he uses from like...
So this is the other thing I was going to say is I don't know how much to engage with the history that he gives because I have no way of determining how accurate it is. Right?
Yeah.
So like other than, I guess you read secondary stuff that people have commented on his histories specifically and their accuracy rather than like his methodology or his theory.
Yeah.
Right? But I mean that requires a lot of like primary document stuff where you like go back and read these original texts and like understand the discourses they're situated within in a way that is very
I read
difficult.
Online on like a blog or something. I read something really interesting about some dude just shared this thing, or he just typed it, or they just typed it. I don't know who the hell they were, but they wrote that criticizing Foucault and the birth of the clinic, that the Egyptians in many ways performed many of the same operations that Foucault was saying gave birth to this kind of medical type gaze, right, where everything fell under the kind of gaze of the speculum or the light and scalpel or whatever that looked into the recesses of the human body. Then this one person was like, the Egyptians did that like long before, right? But for some reason we don't think of that as being, or like Foucault kind of omits that,
right?
And or doesn't consider how different cultures engaged with the body in that way.
Yeah.
And like to what extent is there like a kind of reliance on, if it didn't happen in Europe, it didn't fucking happen, right? It did not exist.
Right.
Which is, again, perhaps a petty criticism, but I thought it was interesting because, when I first read this stuff, I was like, oh my god, can't believe this was they did this and it was clear and it became this after that, and that was it.
Right. So the critique that I hear there is not specifically the history that he uses, but could there be other modes of like power relations and subjectifications in non-Western cultures?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because like he bases his whole theory of power and subjectification on these texts that he excavates from classical era in mainly like Spain, France, Germany, England.
Then we found our resistance. You just step outside those boundaries, and now you're.
Yeah, so, I mean, the question is like, how universal are the mechanisms and mechanics that he finds?
Exactly.
Or are they just European?
I feel like there are many instances where people don't question that. People are really prepared to say, yeah, this is applicable everywhere, under every instance, even in like this context, like the West.
Right.
Like these ideas apply everywhere, which I'm like instantly suspicious about. Like, I don't know if Foucault's theory of panopticism can be applied as well to like plantations as it can to prisons. I don't know if these two systems or this explanation can encapsulate both of these phenomena.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I guess, even more like indigenous societies.
Yeah, sure, exactly. Yeah. That's
like
a better example.
Like not even like where there isn't even like a contact with European discourse yet.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, part of his point, or like part of the reason you say like that's like a hard critique to make is like he was interested in the classical era in France.
Yeah, and
so like that's what he worked on, and like it's what it can tell us about the present in France, or like his contemporary period in France. So you can't really fault the guy for doing the work that he wanted to do.
No, and for my own part, it's not a gripe with Foucault, but how some people take him up.
Yeah, how universalizable is it?
And they're like, yeah, I can do this anywhere, and to which I'm sure Foucault would be like, get out of here, like, you clown. I was talking about Linnaeus and Like Ricardo, maximum.
I don't know what he would claim, like whether those are actually the like universal mechanisms of power and how they work or not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, he died too young. He would have addressed all that, I'm sure. Yeah. I don't know. I think that's good for now. I feel like we've gravitated far enough from this text.
Yeah.
Kind of gotten away from
We've
its pull.
exploded away from it.
We've reached escape velocity.
Right, exactly.
We've gotten out of the power relations. Well,
if only briefly.
Anyways, if you made it this far,
congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations.
Or condolences.
Yeah. If you didn't turn it off at the toward the end of the first video, then really I'm impressed. But for those that did, thank you for listening. And if you got any beef with us, you know how to leave it. Just try to make it constructive. Don't make me cry by saying mean things.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Oh, you're welcome. See you later, Alex. Good luck with your thesis. Yeah, it's a long process. Anyways, take care, everyone. Bye.